actually see the slides, but that's okay because I'll talk to them and then I'll get rid of the slides and we'll get onto some real conversation. So welcome again. We pay respects and acknowledge the traditional landowners. If you would like to, please introduce yourself via the chat function. This is a safe, respectful space, so we welcome banter and disagreement, but please do so respectfully. The session is being recorded and will be hosted on the Barclay website after the event. Screenshots might be used for social media posting, so it's up to you whether you have your cameras on or off, but we prefer on for interaction. Microphones off, please, just to keep to help with the focus unless you're talking. And at any time throughout the session, please use your hands up function or post questions in the chat. And if we can't get to them during the session, we will get responses to you when we send out the post session email. So today, as I mentioned, we're talking about gender inequity in schools. We're here for 90 minutes, but for anyone that can't stay for the full 90, that's okay, I understand, and will be recorded, and we'll send you a post session summary email as well. Just a few quotes to kind of get the mood going. One of my favorites recently from Jane Caro is speak up, get loud, collaborate, and mobilize. When we were having some interaction on LinkedIn around what can we actually do to make schools more equitable spaces. And never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, is the only thing that ever has. So I suppose that's part of what drives us here today, is getting people together who care about kids and schools and equity, and what we can do to make things better. So you might recall that in about 5 weeks ago, we had session 1 of the series, and that's the beautiful people who helped us out in that session are on the screen for anyone who can see the screen. Hopefully that's most people. If you can't, as I said, you'll get a copy, or you might have been here for that discussion. And today, here are the beautiful people who have given up their time and will be giving up their expertise and thoughts to help us, and I'll introduce them more later throughout the session. So some of the things that have driven us to have these conversations around gender and equity in schools relate to these types of diagrams that you might see on the screen. Our Watch and Mate Bystander have been talking about the connection between gender-based violence and I suppose the earlier aspects of that on the spectrum, and that includes things like rigid gender norms, discrimination. And so what we're trying to do is take a proactive, preventative approach to some of the things that we're seeing in society that we don't really want to see. There's a little bit about me in the pack, but I don't want to talk about me today because there's more interesting, more clever people in the room, but that is in there for anyone who cares or is interested as to how I got interested in this space. And I'm a fairly newcomer to the space. In the last couple of years, I've been digging into the equity in schools space, but I've been a long time DEI advocate, and I've worked a lot in the HR space. So when we did our research into schools, not only did, and I'll talk to that in a sec, not only did we look at policies and procedures and content, but we looked at the web imagery that schools used. And what you can see there on the screen, hopefully, is a representation of the types of disability representation that we found on the school website. And it's intentionally blank because it's when we started to look into gender equity in schools, we quickly realised that the equity issues in schools were far beyond gender, and representation matters, as you all probably hopefully agree, and things like disability representation, there was none that we found on mainstream schools websites. Just go on silent if you can, if you just joined. Thank you. So we had an idea to jump in and have a look at how equitable schools were. There's a lot of discussion, obviously, around how equitable workplaces are. And so we were just curious, and we were driven by the quote, and I've got it there on the screen for anyone that can see it, the Desmond Tutu quote, that we need to stop pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in the first place, rather than just dealing with the consequences later. So I've included some information in this pack about the methodology, but I'm going to skip over it really quickly because, as I said, it's not about me, but we had a really thorough process of research when we looked into gender equity in Gold Coast schools. We partnered with some academics, and that's our process there. I'll include a copy of our paper in the email as well. And essentially what we found is a variance of gender equity between different types of schools. So we found a variance between religious and non-religious schools, a variance between public and private schools, and obviously, as you would expect, a variance between single-sex and co-ed schools. So kind of supported our hypotheses, but also, as I mentioned, when we were doing the research, we were exposed to a lot of other types of potential inequity that led us to this intersectional conversation today. So I've included in the pack some responses from the research by some very clever, respected people in the industry, and you can see that there. And I want to pay respect to some of the fantastic people that have paved the way for some of the work we're doing, like Girls Uniform Agenda, who worked really hard to try and make sure that all schools across Australia provide pants and shorts options for girls, even though some schools still do not, unfortunately. So I'll just flick over these slides because they will be better for the pack, and there's a range of quotes in there for your reading pleasure later. But suffice to say, there's a lot of people have said a lot of things about why equity and inclusion are important in schools. And a teaser for everyone on the call right now, we are planning a session 3 in the trilogy. As someone mentioned to me yesterday, I'm going to reuse it, that today is the Empire Strikes Back episode. So no pressure, but a lot of people will say that it's the best. So, maybe today will be the best, we'll see. But nevertheless, we've got session 3 coming, and we've got some fantastic people who have already agreed to contribute to that conversation. So look forward to that coming out soon. Now, today, I'm just going to flick through quickly the beautiful people who have donated their time and energy to be a part of today's conversation. So Madison Harrington, Stephen Zisserman, Tanya Kovacs, Shannon Miller, Michelle Lim, William DeJean, Sonia Simmons, Liam Walsh, Beck Bridson, James Headlam, and Nikki Tagano. So thank you to everyone, and I can't see everyone on the screen right now, but I hope that you're all with us and I'll find out very shortly when I ask you a question. And there's some other follow-up information in the pack as well about Barclay, if you were wondering who is Barclay, and if you want to get in touch. So that's the pack. Hopefully most of you could see it. I'm going to stop sharing. That's 10 minutes, so I did pretty much right on time. And now we're going to get into some conversation. So if you've just joined, microphones off, and yeah, we're gonna jump in. So I'm going to try and introduce people as I pan to them, or if you jump in, speakers, feel free to introduce yourself if I haven't had a chance yet. But let's talk about equity in schools, and let's talk about why it's important. Let's go beyond gender. And so when we're talking about equity, loosely, we're talking about fairness. Now, fairness doesn't necessarily mean the same for everyone, as some of you might be familiar with the equity versus equality kind of comparison. But we want spaces in schools to be fair for kids. We want them to be safe, and then we want them to feel included for whoever they are. So I might just pan to you first, Stephen. If hopefully you're on the line. So Stephen Zisman is a dad, and an educator, and an equity advocate. And I wanted to just talk about equity in schools, but in relation to the topical kind of conversation that's happening around positive masculinity, and the link there to gender-based violence prevention. So we've gone straight into the heavy stuff for you, Stephen. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Mark. I wouldn't expect anything less. Hello, all. It's a huge topic, right? So where is well, I'm a primary school teacher, so full disclosure there. And what are schools doing about the gender equity piece in primary schools? Because this is the underlying social condition for violence against women and all gender-based violence, using the Our Watch model. Well, let's see. I guess, look, it's a funny one because in one way they are following a model that was set up in the 1820s about boys and girls sitting in little rows. It's a very feminized industry, as you know. High school is a bit more gender equal. There's more men, more male teachers. When I started primary teaching about 12 years ago, it was often there were two men in the organization. There was the principal and the GA, and I think that kind of says it all. Really, the leadership role and the executive and the and the physical labourer. But it's changed a lot since. I guess there's a bit of a level playing field when it comes to well, there's an unlevel playing field. I mean, there is no level playing field in terms of gender in Australia. Everyone comes from a different space, and the kids enter, but they are socialised into their gendered roles very, very strongly and structurally, and sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously. I'm pretty aware of this space. I try and unpick it. I try and challenge it, but it's not always possible. And I see the same kind of patterns repeating again and again. I walked into a kindy. Just a little anecdote. I walked into a kindy a couple of days ago, and one of them put their hand up. They wanted to say hello to the new teacher, and one of them, little boy, put his hand up and said, "You are amazingly handsome," and that beautiful sincerity just shining from him, which is gorgeous, right? I have a feeling, that sadly a lot of that sincerity and that, male to male kind of, I guess, compliment will be socialized out of him in a few years, And look, what I don't see a lot of is teachers who are super conscious about this stuff really actively challenging it and really actively sort of taking what, like, you might call gender transformative approaches or something like that. I know there's a little bit of stuff happening in high schools, which is really interesting. Kids are leading the way around, exploring gender identity and sexual expression and different ways of being, non-binary and so forth. That's where it comes from. They're really leading the way. But in the primary schools, they're pretty staid places in terms of the gender piece, and I don't see a lot of interrogation of it. I see a lot of business as normal, and that's because, well, there's 1,000 reasons. There's 10,000 reasons why. So yeah. I don't know if I answered your question, Mark, or responded to your comment, but I tried to paint a bit of a picture of the state in primary schools, and I hope I did so.
No, you did, and thank you so much. And your voice and experience as a teacher is so powerful. But as you said, also, as a dad, and what you see in the schoolyard, and I know myself with two young kids, I still see the boys will be boys attitude, playing out in the schoolyard at young ages, and kind of, what message are we sending boys that an appropriate way to resolve conflict is through violence. So lots to. I feel like I could talk to you all day, Stephen, but I probably say that to all the panelists today. But I'm just going to stay with that for a minute and stick on gender. And I'm going to go to you, Nikki, and I'm mindful that Nikki has to jump off at half time today. So I really appreciate you squeezing us in, Nikki. So Nikki's the CEO and founder of Scene Culture, and she's on a mission to shine a light on untapped potential, to create a world where everyone feels seen, which sounds beautiful and very similar to what we spoke about earlier. I'm going to use a quote and then I'm going to ask you a question, Nikki, just to give you a moment to compose yourself. This is from the Australian Gender Equality Council. The current education system plants the seeds of gender inequality in each new generation, representing a fundamental cause of gender inequality. In answer to this, rather than addressing one of the primary root causes of gender inequality, um, the system has to date focused its energies on funding the treatment of the symptoms of gender inequality rather than confronting head-on the generation of stereotypes in Australian schools. So, Nikki, I'd love to get your voice following on from what Stephen was saying and inspired by the work that HEC do. What do you think some gender equity initiatives are that schools could adopt that we're seeing more so in the workplaces?
Thank you. Well, I guess to just add a little bit more context for how I answer this question, a big part of what I advocate for is for people who are typically overlooked for a myriad of reasons, primarily, but though through the lens of bias, whether it be conscious or unconscious, and the impact that that can have in particular on people that aren't typically found in very influential roles. And so thank you, Mark, for referencing our vision. And a big part of why it's important. Sorry, have I frozen?
No, I've got you.
Okay, great. A big part of why we really get behind the importance of things like gender equity is, our vision is to shine a light on underrepresented talent, neurodiverse individuals, introverted individuals. Now, I say those three categories as someone with lived experience of them, and it's the experience that I had when I was young, growing up at school, that I felt put me in a position to be overlooked for a myriad of different things. One was my competence in certain areas. Another example, for instance, is my ADHD. And I think I use that as a really great example as to how behaviors can influence gendered stereotypes sometimes, and what that means is as well that often these things are overlooked. In terms of what's happening in the workplace, we are intentional about having more data-driven approaches to how we identify who competent individuals are in relation to the work they do, which I believe can be applied in an education system in a similar fashion. Right, when we really know and understand what the driving or leading indicators are of competence and performance or intelligence, rather than the lagging indicators, which is something that we only see after we've already gone too far. Where I believe we can start, however, as people who are influencing this particular sector, is understanding what our own biases are, particularly when it comes to things like so I have a background in psychology, and I talk about Dunning-Kruger effect, which is where we can often mistake confidence for competence, and noting that we can learn from that in an education, in the education and school sector, as well as in the workplace. So just because someone is highly confident, it has no relationship with their ability to be competent. And so I'll leave it there. But thank you for having me.
No, thanks so much, Nikki. And it sounds like what you're doing at Scene Culture is absolutely amazing. I'd like to pick up on that data aspect, if I might, and just drill, and either yourself, Nikki, can jump back in, or I know that there's some other people on our panel today with a keen interest in the intersection between technology and equity. How do you see the role of technology in schools, and how can it help drive equity?
I'm slow to respond to see if someone else might want to jump in. But I believe it's the way that we can use technology is more just as an aid or an additional tool that can be used to scale the ways in which we are able to level the playing field. So I still think it's important that, you know, we as human beings are governing quite a lot of how we promote greater equity within schools, but we have to do quite a lot of work to understand what those indicators and those drivers are. And so I think some of it can be used, for instance, in the way that, for instance, things are marked or graded, and then also the criteria that sit behind it, and really interrogating what embedded inequitable practices might we need to just review, or you know, in the criterias that a lot of children are measured against, that might have inequity embedded within it, and or inequitable processes embedded within it, particularly as well, even within the format of classrooms where we need to bring greater voice to those who are quiet. Now, I speak from someone who was mute for the first few years of my life, including when I was in at school, and so I literally didn't have a voice. But there are ways that I could still communicate, or at least there could have been ways that I could still communicated my competence in. And so looking at different ways that we can use technology to enable that, in light of not necessarily being an extroverted, you know, individual that's speaking up.
Thanks, Nikki. And thanks for holding space before, as you did. I love that approach. I could see that Liam was. I'm going to pan to you, Liam, because I saw you might come off, and I want to get your thoughts on this as well. So everyone, you know, I'd like to introduce Liam Walsh. So Liam is a dad, an author. He's an ex 9-to-5 warrior, and you know, he is very interested. So I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on this, Liam, in terms of the interplay between technology and equity in schools. I can't hear you, Liam. Or at least I can't. Can other people hear Liam? Maybe it's me. No? That's okay. Well, look, I will leave you to troubleshoot. James, yes, you're on the call. James is one of our speakers today. James isn't feeling well today, so I really appreciate you being with us, James. Well, I didn't want to pan to you because I didn't know how you were feeling, but yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, James, and then Liam, hopefully you can join in as well.
No worries, Mark. This is sort of in my wheelhouse a little bit. I'm a primary teacher by trade. Did a master's, maybe 16 months to find out that student outcomes was the only important thing. Could have spent my time better relaxing after the workday. Started a PhD last year, and so I'm looking at technology and the human experience. So pretty exciting space to be in. I think a big concern for me is a lot of the things that, as a teacher, what you find is so important, and what you put a lot of your heart into as a teacher doesn't really get recognised, and we focus on outcomes, we focus on measurement, data, and outcomes. And I think this is part of the reason why it's so complex. Is as a teacher, we want to keep our job, we have a mortgage. What do we need to do? We need to collect data, we need to record it. And then we forget about the things that actually count, which is about the students, you know, as people, as individuals, able to express themselves. And by the time you have the effort and energy to, you know, address these issues, you got the next assessment coming around, you got the, you know, the next lot of reporting, and it becomes really difficult as a teacher. I can sort of echo what Stephen was saying earlier. Like my school that I most recently worked in was quite dominated by females. We had some female leaders. Most of the leaders were females, and it was probably uncommon But it was interesting to note that there was still quite a few disparities in the policies around uniforms and those sorts of things. But yeah, I think with technology, we often we hear about the digital divide. But personally, I think the definition's wrong, because often the digital divide just talks about having access to technology, but I think it's more how you are capable of using it is what the divide is. And as we know, it's often used to reinforce these things, or created by straight white males in Silicon Valley and those sorts of things. And then it gets even more complex when we start to talk about AI. And yeah, it's going to be a complex time ahead, I think.
Thanks so much, James. Really appreciate your thoughts and all the best with your PhD. I'm glad that you're looking into this space, and I hope you're feeling better. Liam, just testing, are you on the line, and have you troubleshot your microphone issues? If not, we'll come back to you. No, that's all right. Oh, here we go. Liam, have we got you?
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Oh, yay. Sorry about that. I think it was something to do with the app versus a browser, and mostly just me. So yeah, in answer to your question, Mark, as it pertains to like equity in schools and tech, it feels a lot like we collectively consider it a little bit like technology sits outside, almost like the infrastructure to do things, and then separately we tend to think about it as social media or platforms, all those things, but they live in a box, and we have cybersecurity sessions, and we educate ourselves respectively like that, versus it being critical and more integrated from a systemic level or systems level, because all the good work that happens around equity can be some very much undone by what happens in tech. And again, collectively, there is a temptation right now to acknowledge a problem that tech is delivering horrible things with regards to equity, truly horrendous, but it sits inside this construct of banning technology as this thing that sits outside of education or sits outside of a family, and trying to bring these things in so that families have a responsibility, particularly parents like myself, have a responsibility to understand technology, and, to be really blunt, resist that temptation to say things like, I just don't understand what is happening over there. We just need to get the kids off it, because that doesn't work. We have to understand it, because that's where children, primary school and senior school are living, and it's not integrated.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I'm really glad that you made that point about integrated, because I think that lends itself to the conversation about intersectional equity as well, that we're trying to generate today. And we've spoken a bit about gender, and we've spoken a bit about technology, and I'm going to kind of segue a little bit, but it's intentional, because I want to start to dance around the other aspects of equity that we want to cover off on today. And Tanya, I'm gonna pan to you, if that's okay, because I think that integrated aspect that Liam was talking about, leans really well into your space. I might be wrong, but I'll leave you to jump in. But so for everyone, Tanya Kovac is a founder and CEO of Gender Lens Australia, and has over 20 years experience as a gender equity change specialist. Tanya, I'd love to hear your thoughts about equity in schools and the intersectional aspect in particular.
Well, I was just, before we go there, I just wanted to pick up a little bit on what Liam was talking about. I mean, we've seen some really concerning things in technological education in the last couple of weeks, where you've got very, very well funded organisations that are supposed to be providing intersectionally diverse education in technology that are then being found to be sexual predators towards young girls who want to engage in tech. We've got huge problems with gender equality in STEM. And so the importance of having parents involved in programs with schools to develop respectful relationships is a key part of what I see needs to happen. We've had some transformative policies made. The role of respectful relationships education in schools is designed to talk about gender equality, but also to talk about respectful relationships across multiple different attributes, to be inclusive of LGBTIQ students. That's very close to home for me. I have 2 children who identify as LGBTIQ, and I can tell you that journey is not always easy for them in a schooling environment, but also to be inclusive of people from different backgrounds in terms of their abilities, their cultural background too. One of the problems with respectful relationships education is that it is not always delivered in the way that's best practice. It should be a whole of school approach that involves parents, teachers, and students, but often doesn't do that. It's often just little small incursions that then disappear, and that is a weakness in the approach. Why do we do that? Why do governments do that? There's not enough money. Why is there not enough money? And that's where Gender Lens Australia has become very focused on looking at budgets and putting a gender lens on budgets and investment. So I've become really I never thought, and this is how we met, Mark. I never thought that I would be the kind of advocate who would be sitting down, pouring through numbers and statistics. And maths was not my favourite subject at school, but I've found myself in a situation where looking at the federal and state and territory budgets is a big part of my work. I can tell you that we only invest 3.2%, 3.2% in activities that are considered to be for women, girls, and gender equality. I'm not kidding. And that's by the government's own adding up. And the way that Mark and I met was me going through and doing some of this analysis and discovering that that one of my great concerns for gender equality, which is the role of the differential funding between private schooling and public schooling, which I see as being a big problem for gender equality, and we can talk about that perhaps later. Mark and I found that private school investment is enormous. It is bigger than all of the welfare in the entire nation. It is bigger than all of the areas that you could possibly think of. It is like the 3rd biggest investment, and this is a big problem for gender equality. Huge. And happy to talk about that further, Mark.
Oh, absolutely. Love your passion there, Tanya. I'm right there with you. I'm an accidental activist. Didn't plan on being here, but here I am. Stephen, before I have a follow-up question for Tanya, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just on your point about multiple excellent points, well made. Just on the respectful relationships education. So I did that at university for the last 6 or so years, and Michael Flood did some research that it takes 12 to 15 hours to essentially change someone's mind about this stuff. And that's even if they're in the movable middle, let alone someone who's resistant. Now, in my experience, you need to create the time and the safe space to allow for reflection. And that's complex, and that's a massive time investment. So yeah, so there's a comprehensive approach, like with the Victorian Respectful Relationships curriculum, but it does need to be normalized, and I think it will take a long time for people to say, aha, this is not actually challenging to me, this is normalizing, so there's a long-term approach. But how incredibly frustrating is that when you just get piecemeal, when you think, no, hold on a second, this is relevant now. Yeah, so I absolutely hear your pain there. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I'm going to come back to you, Tanya, just with a follow-up question, because I like poking the bear sometimes. So let me just read a quote. So this is by Murray Watt, if you're familiar with Murray. So he recently, I took a quote because I was very interested in this. We're very proud about the fact that our embassies promote Australian values internationally, and I'm very concerned to see an overseas government seemingly take action against an Australian embassy that is upholding Australian values. So he was recently in defence of the Australian ambassador to Tehran when they posted support on Wear It Purple Day. So I found that really interesting, that support of our LGBTQI community is espousing Australian values. And yet many private schools in Australia continue to discriminate against LGBTQI students and staff. So is it fair to say then that these schools are not upholding Australian values and yet they continue to take Australian taxpayer funding?
Mark, you are really poking the bear, but I probably wouldn't go as far as saying that. But let's talk about this issue of how funding for differential funding for state and private schools is impacting gender equality. It's a very simple equation. If you are receiving government funding and you are receiving funding that is, you would hope would be in line with those Australian values, the laws that we have, which are about protecting LGBTIQ plus people and being intersectionally inclusive, you are required to educate and have obligations to educate in line with those teachings. Unfortunately, when you are funded in a private environment, there are not the same kind of ties to that funding. And because state and territories provide the actual oversight of education, but they are not the funders because the federal government is giving that, they don't have a lot of say over what that money is being spent on. And so we can't, you can only influence in respectful relationships and gender equality where there is a capacity to have a policy and legislative direction over that area. I look at some of the perverse educational activities that we've seen come out of very, very wealthy male-dominated schools, some very difficult incidents involving girls at other local high schools and other sister schools. And I think that, these are institutions that are hoping to make the future ASX leaders, the future politicians, and they have an even bigger onus to sign on to commitments to respectful relationships and LGBTIQ plus safe school projects. They should be required to do that. So you and I, Mark, you and I are openly very strong about this issue. Not everyone will necessarily share that position. I think what I found in that budget, I find very concerning, and I find it concerning for public education, of which I'm a beneficiary of, and my children are attending it. So I declare that. But I find it even more concerning for what it means for gender equality. I think it's very, very problematic.
Thanks so much, Tanya. Look, yes, we'll break. Everyone take a deep breath. We won't go deeper into that rant, but I absolutely could. But I suppose a good opportunity to step back a little bit is I'd love to hear from you, Madison. So Madison Harrington is joining us today, and she's an experienced workplace lawyer at Gilchrist Connell in Melbourne, and she works in the discrimination and human rights spaces. Now, it may feel like a clunky segue, but I can assure you that there is a connection there, because what I'd love to hear from you, Madison, is when does equity and discrimination become illegal? Like where does that line cross? Because schools can discriminate, and in society we make judgments and rules around groups of people and what we think are appropriate for those groups of people. But where's that line between, inappropriate in accordance with legislation and, something that we just have to accept?
Yeah, look, thanks, Mark, for having me, and thank you, everyone. Apologies for being a bit late. The Teams link wasn't working for me either, so you know, joys of technical difficulties. Yeah, look, it's a really interesting one, and I mean, I'm sort of reflecting on what Tanya had to say, coming from a queer background myself and sitting on the board of several LGBT not-for-profits, as well as obviously my professional background as an employment lawyer, and prior to moving into private practice several years ago, working for one of the largest universities in Queensland as their in-house employment counsel, and having a mother who is a teacher. So I'm sort of intimately involved with the education system in various respects. I myself went to school grew up in Sydney before moving back to Christchurch in New Zealand to do my high schooling. So I've seen the education system both in Australia and in New Zealand. So I think, it's certainly very interesting to reflect and contrast in some ways about how things stand across the Tasman as well. But to answer your question, Mark, I think it to give a typical lawyer's answer of it depends. There is no clear-cut way to draw that line in the sand, so to say, of what constitutes discrimination, because really, are we talking gender? Are we talking sexuality? Because again, there's different rules for different aspects of it, unfortunately. And that's the thing, is there is no harmony, there is no uniformity in this space. And that's what ultimately leads to that inequitable outcome for students. As far as my views go, look, these are my views. They're not representative of the law firm that I work for or anything like that. But it's a difficult question, because take Queensland, for instance. Queensland has just passed through amendments to its Discrimination Act, Anti-Discrimination Act, I should say, Freudian slip there, which actually now go further than any other state, Queensland being now the most progressive state in the country, which to me is baffling because it's Queensland. Apologies to any Queenslanders here.
No, I'm in Queensland and I agree.
But Queensland now has a positive duty. Obviously, we've heard of in recent times the positive duty to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace, which occurred post the Respect at Work report in 2020. Queensland has now taken that one step further as part of its recent amendments to now prohibit and impose a positive duty to prevent any form of discrimination in the workplace. And obviously for teachers, that will obviously go some way to impacting teachers and their relationships with students, how they go about that as well. So it's not just sexual harassment, but it's positive duty now to prevent things like homosexuality, preventing discrimination on the basis of one's sexuality, for instance. So to me, it's a really difficult conversation, because I think particularly with religious schools, we see differing standards, once again, of religious schools having certain exemptions, for instance, under the Sex Discrimination Act at a federal level, which do allow them to take active steps to discriminate against queer students, for instance, simply because it accords with their so-called religious values, not because that's something that was written in the Bible, for instance, but rather because that is their school's interpretation or their faith's interpretation of said religious text. Now, in the circumstances, I think it's something that we shouldn't be seeing in 2024. Children are children regardless of their sexuality or gender identity, and they deserve the right to be safe and supported at school. The Queensland Human Rights Commission most recently, and I think it was about 2020, released a trans at school sort of investigation. And I think that's where we see most of the issues arising, is our trans and gender diverse young people are the most at risk in any school environment. Now, whether that is because they're openly out or not out at all, and therefore being bullied as a result of it, it's a really difficult environment to be in for a young person. And I think it's really important that schools do actually take into consideration the psychosocial well-being of their students as part of that, regardless of what any faith argument may put forward. At the end of the day, these are minors that we're dealing with here. The role of a school, regardless of, in my view, whether they are religious or not, is to educate. And so as a result, I go, the current laws do not go far enough and provide too many loopholes, I think, allowing schools to discriminate, and not in a positive way. We don't see the sort of positive discrimination really occurring in this country towards LGBT students, for instance. And so as a result, I think it's a really difficult one, because there's this inherent conflict. I find most teachers are generally supportive of LGBT youth, but you know, even then from a staffing perspective, to again bring it back to religious schools, because they're the ones that are that have these exemptions in place currently, you know, you can still be fired in some states for being an openly gay teacher. We've seen that time and time again in media in recent years. And so, again, it's just simply a blight in the system whereby it's 2024, we've got marriage equality. I go, well, what's next? Well, we've still got a long way to go in that regard. And a lot of that is to do and to address those systematic issues that arise from the very beginning of treating everyone with respect and accepting that society is inherently diverse. So to answer your question, Mike, there is not really an answer because every state treats it differently, and ultimately discrimination is an inherent part of the way we operate our schooling systems, as far as I'm concerned, and that's not a good thing. But that is the system in which we do operate currently, and the system as it works. And it's interesting how you mentioned Murray Watt's reference of Australian values before. I would take a controversial view here and say that discrimination is an inherent Australian value in the worst possible way. So I find it a tad contradictory to be coming out and saying that whilst I agree with Minister Watt that the Iranian embassy should be supporting Wear It Purple Day, I do find it somewhat conflicting, shall we say, that you know, it is apparently an issue in that regard, because I think, as we've seen time and time again, at least in my 20-odd years in this country, discrimination is an inherent bias in this country. You know, I think back to my early days living in Australia and having the Cronulla riots, and you know, then from that point on, we see it time and time again. If you're not white, if you're from a different country, we are going to discriminate you. That is, unfortunately, the modus operandi of the vast majority of politicians in this country. So, and that unfortunately then extends to queer people and queer children as a whole, and it's just a big old mess, quite frankly. So I don't really have, you know, any clear-cut answer to that. It's a vexed issue and $1 million question that I wish I did have an answer to, because it's so fundamentally important to human rights as a whole. So yeah, happy to sort of, you know, have a conversation with anyone and sort of build on that further. But I think schools do play an integral part in ensuring that our next generation are capable and supported to be their true selves, either at school or in the workplace. And I think whilst it's acceptable to, I feel it's acceptable for the most part to be gay in the workforce these days, I think we still have a long way to go. And I think that change starts with being safe and supported at school and ensuring that next generation of leaders are therefore safe and comfortable to be their true selves moving forward as well. And that's the primary importance of schooling to me. And I mean, I even think back to my schooling days. For context, I am a millennial. I, you know, went to school in the 2000s, but you know, we still grew up in you know, a generation where it wasn't really acceptable to be gay. I went to a co-ed Scottish school in Christchurch, New Zealand, and we had obviously a head boy and a head girl. And as part of that, what was very interesting, it was a Presbyterian school, and our head boy was openly gay. And it was funny going back to school, you know, a couple of years ago, and seeing the change that had happened in the space of 5 years, say, of going, well, oh, there's now pride flags at school. There's now a queer room at school. So not only was it my generation going, okay, we've moved on enough that we can have a head boy at school who identifies as not straight and is gay, but now we've taken that extra step forward. And so I think that's what we really need to start seeing, is not only that acceptance, but also that true acceptance of going, yep, sure, it's okay to be gay, but despite being gay, you can still be head boy, still be head girl, or be non-binary and be neither. And I think, as I say, ensuring that safety is paramount. The duty of care which schools owe to students, I think, is really important to keep into consideration here, and it's something that I find gets left off the table so often as part of these discussions. So I think it's, yeah, paramount to ensure that duty of care actually goes so far as to, again, ensuring that students, even if they're, you know, LGBT, are still safe and supported at school as well.
Madison, that was so good. Your check's in the mail. No, we're all doing this out for volunteer today, but that was so brilliant, and I could talk to you all day. But yeah, yeah, as much as many people would disagree with me, I always love to have a lawyer in the room because I think, it's important to understand the way
Look, we
things
charge in
are.
6-minute increments. We've got
Yeah,
talking
that's
down
right.
to a fine art.
That's right. I'm so glad for your time then in that regard. But I think it's important to understand, like what you said, in schools, we do discriminate right now. And whether we here today agree with it or not, and probably most of us here today are already the converted that we don't agree with it. But if you do, that's up to you. But I think part of the objective was today is to talk about the discrimination, to talk about the inequity, to talk about the different types of inequity, what they are, what they look like. But then also this last kind of half an hour or so, I really want to shift to what we can do about it. I want us to walk away from today feeling that we are not helpless, that we can do something about it. And even though I'm not here to talk necessarily about myself today, I'm on a mission to try and do something about it myself. And these conversations are part of that, is to try and get people on board and thinking about, well, we do discriminate in schools. Are we okay with that? If we're not, what's the process look like to actually change that? You mentioned there, kids are kids, and I think most people would agree that all kids should feel safe, all kids should be supported, and all kids should be loved for who they are and not necessarily told who they should be. And yet we do. Every day in many schools, and that makes me sad. And thank you for sharing your personal insight into that as well, Madison. I really appreciate it. And I'll before I pan to someone else, I want to, as you were talking, I looked up a quote because it reminded me of a Richard Dennis quote recently from the Australia Institute, where he was quoted as saying, an increasing amount of public money to schools is going to subsidise groups that discriminate in ways that the general public and often the parents at the schools themselves disagree with. So I saw that statistic, and it might be the same one that you refer to, Madison, in the sense that most staff and parents at private schools support LGBTQI youth, and yet the policies at the schools in some ways do not. So there's an imbalance there. And I think, as much as we're talking negatively in some aspects today, I think there has been incredible progression in the public system around inclusion. But I think that there are some schools who are still catching up. But I want to drill into that aspect of telling kids who they should be, and I want to hear from Shannon, if that's okay, Shannon, on that note, because when that came up in Madison's reflections about who kids should be, I thought of you and the work that you do. And for everyone, Shannon is a disability and family violence practice leader in Albury-Wodonga. He's worked across a variety of areas, including child protection, Aboriginal communities, and family violence programs. And Shannon and I have spoken a few times about the role of boys, and the many discussions that are happening at the moment around positive masculinity, what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a man, how we can shape future men that we, the ideal future men, shall we say, even though there may not be an ideal, but, positive future men, respectful future men in how we treat boys now. So I'd love to hear from your experience, Shannon, on this type of matter.
Yeah, sure, thanks. And yeah, we have had many chats on this in the past. I guess ideal man might be a bit subjective there, depending on where you're coming from. Yeah, so I guess I probably circle back to the original comments that Stephen was making, really around referencing the drivers of violence for Our Watch, and looking at and for those who may not be familiar with Our Watch's work, you've got that they designate the key drivers of violence, which it's across professionals and different sectors don't agree with it. Certainly, I'm very aligned with the Our Watchers views, and and that's been the major drivers of family violence. I think you could even exclude the family part. I think just violence. And that's male control decision making, views of women's roles in society, the support of essentially advocating for the use of violence. And when we talk about that, we're sort of it's a really bizarre sort of society we have where we family violence is in the media. We want to address crime, we want to address violence against women, we want to reduce femicide, but we've got but we'll go put UFC on the on main event and teach kids this is entertainment, being someone up, this is fun, this is awesome, but then every other area of society say actually no, that's not okay. So it's a really bizarre point there. But so I guess, like with Sam's original comments around the primary school is, we're seeing these, like we've got respectful behaviours, we've got, all this commentary on social media in schools, your Andrew Tates, your Mark Sings, all these influencers are taking young boys under their wing and teaching them disrespectful women. I mean, that's 10 years too late. I mean, these values and beliefs on women, on violence, on how boys should behave, they're in their head 10, 12 years before they even know who Andrew Tate is. And any other social media sort of person and influencer that comes along. And, as I work in the space, I do programs in schools. I'm also a father. And, my son was probably in prep for a week before I was saying to, pick him up, drop him off and see, these aggressive interactions between boys. Like these are 6-year-old kids. And they're already using violence, already using that aggression, already being segregated into their groups. Girls are different from boys. You're in this group, you're in that group, and it extends to like even like just the school we have is actually doing a really good job as far as that gender equality piece. There's been, and uniforms. I know Mark and I have discussed this. Big piece around uniforms. Around we've made a stance. We're not going to have a different uniform boys, different uniform for girls. We're not going to have a boy colour, a girl colour. It's all the same. You choose how you want to dress, how you want to present yourself to the school. But even in that space, like we're still, you go to school meetings and it's, the boys, boys' sporting achievements are, the highlight of the assembly. Girls' academic achievements, so they mentioned the same thing. That's the last thing we talk about. And that was, I had that just the other week. Assembly, year 6 went to footy comp. They smashed, they demolished the other team, all this sort of stuff. And that was really the highlight of the whole assembly. And then sort of at the end, they had, I think 3 or 4 young girls that, won an academic competition with us. I think it was a debate that they had. And that was just like such an afterthought, like that wasn't important. You just see it throughout schools. So I think, we talk about, addressing violence against women, addressing positive masculinity, negative masculinity, all that, and it's always in reference to looking at 15, 16, 17-year-old boys, where there's the real issues. We're seeing them up their whole lives, all through primary schooling, childcare, encouraging these behaviours, like I said before, Mark, the boys being boys, and we got, until we eliminate that at a young age, we're just role modelling until it's too late and these behaviours become a major societal issue.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. And thanks for everyone who's contributing to the chat today. And thanks, Michelle, for giving me a nudge. I'm gonna hand to you next because I absolutely want to hear from you before you have to drop off at 1:15. And yeah, look, I'm biased, but I agree with everything you're saying there, Shannon. I really appreciate your contribution from your experience, which is vastly more than my own. And I really, that role that boys play, and I like the UFC reference because I think it reflects on the stimulus that we give boys. And it's not just, porn, it's not just social media, it's not just Andrew Tate, it's not just UFC. I think it extends into, cartoons that are pitched at boys, books that are pitched at boys. And even, I was sitting down watching Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles one day, and people might think it's fairly harmless, but it just got me thinking about TV shows that are geared towards boys, and almost every one of them that I could think of involved fighting and involved solving problems through violence and fighting. And it just made me think about, well, what are we really showing kids in terms of the world and what is, normal. I think it also reminded me of that tongue-in-cheek blank slide that I put on earlier that some people might have seen about the disability representation that we found on schools' websites. And I think that, I failed to mention at the time the imagery that we noticed on some schools' websites in the study, and as I mentioned, we'll include a copy of the study in the notes, in the show notes, as they say, and in the email following. But what we found very common on private schools' websites, and I'd challenge you to have a look, because it surprised me, was a white male teacher, often standing, central to the image, with a bunch of diverse children sitting, sometimes around, literally around his feet. And so the subliminal imaging of male superiority, white superiority, and that it really shocked me that I'd never really seen it before, until I started looking at the images. And so I think the stimulus that we give our kids and the stimulus that we give even parents on websites has a role to play, in how we start to shift things around. And I think you've got some really interesting experience from all the work that you've done, and thank you for the work that you do and continue to do, Shannon, in that space. So on that note, in terms of, the role of boys and the role of men in terms of, playing a part in, gender-based violence prevention, I'd love to hear from you, Michelle, because one, you have to go, but I know that you also are very passionate about this space of intersectionality. Yeah, I'll just go straight to you, and I'll let you do an intro for yourself far better than I possibly could.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mark. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, first of all, I'm joining you all from Gadigal land here in Sydney. Lovely to be on the call and having this very important discussion with you all. My name's Michelle. I'm the Organisational Culture and Change Lead at the Reserve Bank Australia. I also am the Deputy Chair of the Race and Cultural Identity, ERG, and I do some work in the governance and ethics space as well with the Ethics Centre here in Sydney. Yeah, to your point, Mark, I think it's really important to also acknowledge the importance of intersectionality. And we've touched on a little bit about this, Madison touched on the importance of having that LGBTQI plus lens when talking about gender equity in schools. And I kind of see this as, as somebody who works in this space from a government perspective, and at the central bank of Australia. Again, my views are my own only and not representative of the bank, but I do kind of feel like it's really important to approach, I guess, gender equity, but more broadly intersectionality and diversity from two ways. And I think right at the moment we're kind of we've spoken a little bit about tackling the structures and the systems and the policies that are inherently racist, biased, sexist, discriminatory, but it's also really important to talk about, we've touched a little bit about this as well, about the importance of building not only cultural literacy at schools, but literacy around intersectionality. And that starts with First Nations literacy. If we don't acknowledge that, then I think we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. We shouldn't be talking about gender diversity in a silo. We all know that, people of color, people that are, disabled or identify as being disabled, people that identify being LGBTQI+, people that are from low socioeconomic backgrounds have compounding effects. The compounding effects of the discrimination is much more severe for people that carry multiple intersectionalities. So I think it really starts with having that conversation at school, having the courage for schools to embed diversity, equity, inclusion in our education system. I think we can't be having these discussions as like an ad hoc conversation, but actually making it part of the curriculum. And that's where the structures and the systems and the policies come in, is that we need to have really clear policies and structures that measure DE&I risk of not talking about diversity. We recently saw in the Channel 9 report and in the ABC as well, the reputational risk that it can actually have on organizations and corporates if we don't talk about DE&I. And the same goes for schools. It all starts at school. So I feel like there's a couple of things at play here, is building the cultural and intersectional literacy within schools and embedding that into our curriculum and education system, but then also having very clear governance, risk governance, measurement and data, clear lines of accountability and consequential accountability for who should be responsible for DE&I. And I think when I say DE&I, for those that might not, I'm sure we all know diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially right now as we're becoming so polarized. I feel like a lot of the work that I do in the ethics space is about creating a space where we can have these types of conversations like the ones that we're having now without feeling like we're going to be cancelled. I think Madison touched on the importance of creating that psychological and cultural safety and safety within schools, and the ability to create and foster environments where people can have these conversations without feeling like they're going to be penalized if they say the wrong thing, rather than seeing it as, an intention to harm. We need to also maybe create those spaces, and leaders and schools need to create those spaces to have these very important conversations in a psychologically safe way. And also for those who identify with intersectionalities, for them to then feel comfortable to also share their lived experience. It's one thing to say, bring your whole self to school, bring your whole self to work. But if we don't actually create the cultures and the environment that really enable people that hold intersectionalities to thrive, then we're really just talking the talk and not really walking the walk. So yeah, just a couple of thoughts from me here. Would really be happy to connect with everyone on the call about this, because this is something very close to my heart, as you know, Mark.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Yeah, look, I know you have to run off, but I'm so glad for your contribution. And I think that's exactly why I wanted you to have a voice today, and why I would encourage everyone to follow and connect with Michelle and the work that she does in intersectional inclusion, because I think it does go beyond gender. Gender is a big part of some of the issues we see, but I think there's that overlap into other issues that is so important. So thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate it. But on that note, and you mentioned it yourself when you were talking about, what we can do, what schools need to do, Michelle, from your perspective, and I want to jump to you, if that's okay, Sonia, because I know that you're very action focused yourself, and you're a self-professed community builder and change maker, and I know that we share many passions for helping kids, and so what I'd like to focus on now is we know these inequalities and discriminations won't go away on their own. So what can we do? We know schools have a role to play. What can they do?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark, and thank you, everybody. This has been such an enlightening and stimulating hour already with you all. So I'm Sonia. I'm from the NGO sector. So I've worked with some frontline agencies around domestic and family-based violence, and I also sit on the board of March for Justice. I'm also running as a Greens candidate in a federal seat. So some of the things we think around this area from a March for Justice point of view, which is sort of the hat that I'm wearing mostly today, is that we know that this is it's no hyperbole to call this sort of a national crisis. In Australia, almost 2 women a week are murdered, and I think 72 women have already lost their lives to violence this year. And that toll masks, the even greater toll of women who are hospitalised or brutalised or left homeless or living in fear. And those are the sort of frontline areas where I've intersected in my work in the NGO space. And I can say that it affects us all and our communities in really deep ways. Forgive me for backtracking a little bit. The things that we know about gender-based violence are that it is driven by inequality, systems of inequality, including things like gender stereotyping, gender roles, men's control of decision-making, cultures of masculinity that emphasise dominance and control, and the ingrained belief that men are somehow worth more. So, for instance, when a woman doesn't have a seat at a table where decisions are being made, it can be assumed that women's voices are not important at all. What's confounding is that in Australia, as Madison has sort of given me a little bit of discussion around, some of these areas in Australia, equality is enshrined in law. So we have laws prohibiting discriminating against women, laws protecting equal pay, those sorts of things, and yet inequality persists as if it's sewn into the fabric of our social norm. And this is where I think we all know that schools have a role to play because of what it means for the belief of people. Now, I grew up and went to a Christian school myself and was raised in the churches. And so I know that there's a lot that is on offer in terms of values-based education that is positive, a civic mindedness, a sense of ourselves as a collective and part of a greater whole. But we also know that these schools can, rather than break down gender stereotypes, they can really perpetuate them. So something I think about a lot, and Tanya spoke to this, is school funding. And some of the things that I've been really interested to see, there was a Productivity Commission report on government services, which showed that I find this staggering, that only 1.3% of public schools in Australia receive 100% of the funding that the Schooling Resource Standard has proposed. And Schooling Resource Standard, the SRS, is the funding that a school requires to get 80% of its students to the above minimum NAPLAN standard. So it's a fairly sort of a bare minimum funding, and only 1.3% of public schools in Australia receive 100% of that funding, whereas by comparison, 98% of private schools are overfunded. And that's why here in Australia, we have one of the most segregated and inequitable school systems in the OECD. So when we talk about what we can do, one of the first things we can do is we can set right a decade of underfunding and gutting of school funding to public schools. We can plug the gap. That means that, for instance, we could plug the gap this year in the next parliamentary sitting, and it would mean that next year kids starting school will go to school in a properly funded public school. And we can talk about developing metrics that hold private schools rather, to account on equality measures as well, which is a conversation that we haven't seen. I, in March for Justice, often use the term inequality benefits only those who hold power, whereas equality benefits us all. And I feel optimistic for us as a nation. I think public education is an area that we continue to lean into and speak towards. And yeah, so my hope is that the next Parliament can do something meaningful in that space.
Thank you so much, Sonia. That was awesome. I loved that, and I'm really glad that the conversation went into another aspect of inequity, which is the funding inequity that we're seeing across our school system, which has an impact. And I think it was, I might be misquoting, but I think it was Dr. Ken Boston, the previous Director General of New South Wales Education, that was recently quoted as saying that no matter what type of equity you're trying to improve in schools, funding underpins everything. So if you're underfunding schools, you've basically got no chance of improving anything, whether it's teacher retention, teacher attraction, or respectful relationships or gender equality. So that funding piece is so important. So thank you. And look, I'm mindful of time, but I can assure you we're saving the best for last, the heavy hitters. But I really appreciate Beck and William staying with us, because with so many fantastic voices, it does take a bit to get everyone around. And I'm glad that this session's being recorded, and we're going to post it on the website, and we'll send out a link, and everyone can connect with you, and hopefully it creates some connections in this community as well, whereby we can work together to help affect some change. So with that in mind, I'd love to hear from you, William, because something that Michelle said before that really jumped out at me, that I thought you might have piqued as well, is around the concept of literacy. So William DeJean, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, William, I'm sorry if I'm not, but has been in the education spaces for over 25 years. He's the host of Unleashed Learning TV online, and plays an active role in trying to help schools be more equitable. So literacy was a word that Michelle used, and I wanted to pick up on that because it's a big push in schools today, and we, from the NAP plan, basic literacy, but even the word itself has many different implications. I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on, why the discussions around gender are actually discussions around literacy, in your opinion.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is my mic's okay? We're good. So
I
I'll be
can.
quick.
Thanks, William.
Watching time, and Beck, I want to make sure you have time to speak. I was recruited out 20 years ago. So I was a high school teacher, an academic. I was recruited to Charles Sturt University in Albury for Shannon, came to Macquarie, been all over the country working with schools, unleashed learnings in schools all over the country. And I didn't grow up in an exam culture. I've taken lots of notes of what everyone's been talking about. And what I'm thinking about right now is there's this exam culture in Australia that I didn't, in fact, as a high school teacher, I think I gave 2 tests ever. So this exam culture, what this exam culture does, what I watch, is it silences a lot of conversations. And what's happening now, that what I'm noticing is now it's about, it changes every week. So, and I'm not trying to be dismissive about it, but now it's direct instruction. Now it's this thing, now it's this thing. One of my favorite quotes, my doctoral work is around literacy. Actually, for context, my doctoral work looked at gay and lesbian teachers across California who are out in their classrooms and the interconnection between their literacy practices and their identities. So everything we're talking about is here, but my favorite definition about what it means to be literate is from James G. Sorry to be academic, but it means to be able to participate in multiple discourse communities successfully. And what I want to suggest then is, so it's a time of and. And means now I'm multilingual. Now I'm learning this technology. Now it's a time of and. And part of this, I think from all my notes here, is we're talking about the literacy of the self and the literacy of other folks. So I call it interpersonal literacies. And so these kind of literacies we're talking about, I'm always curious, what literacy are we talking about? And the literacy of knowing yourself. So a lot of times I work with a lot of positive psychologists, and I kind of joke that we don't just need well-being literacy, we need equity literacy, because a lot of the mental health issues are not because you don't know well-being literacy, you don't know the structure you're in. And the structure you're in is causing your dis-ease. And also, with all due respect to educators, when Unleashed Learning comes to a school, we do a lot of work around teaching from the inside out. And we ask a lot of questions about their histories, their identities, their backgrounds. And I shouldn't say most, I gotta be careful. Many teachers go, I've never been asked this before. So the literacy of the self and also the languaging, because they'll say, I don't want to see race. I don't want to see gender. I'm not supposed to do that. And so there isn't a literacy to negotiate these conversations. And the last thing I'll say, because Beck, I don't want to cut you off. We also need the times we're living in, the resistance, if there is I call it the era of overwhelm. We're literally in a new era. So the era of overwhelm is people are completely overwhelmed with it all, with what's happening. And so if there's resistance to these conversations, it's because folks are like, I can't do any more. But what we actually need is a bigger approach to thinking about what teaching and learning is. And there is a systems thinking approach to this where these conversations fit that can lower stress and boost impact for teaching and learning. But I am curious about the exam culture because it really silences conversations. And the last thing I will say is you can't talk about gender without talking about sexual orientation. You can't talk about this without talking about it's all connected. What I do notice is in poor communities, when I say poor, I'm simply talking about resources, is that those are the students where they'll do direct instruction. It's just about these lesson plans, and it silences all the other conversations. So we really need a bigger approach. And also the last thing I wrote about is the hidden curriculum, because a lot of, they're teaching this, but the hidden curriculum, what you've been all mentioning is it's about boys are this and girls are that, even if it's not spoken about. The website, that's a great example about what men do, what people of color are. So there's a hidden curriculum always going on. So I'm just going to offer, we need a much bigger, to be literate, it's about participating in multiple discourse communities successfully. And we need men, as just as women, to understand their own literacies, their own, who they are, and how to be with other people as well. So I was trying to be quick because I want Beck to be able to speak as well. So that's my push. If we care about literacy, there's a lot more literacies we need to talk about.
Thanks so much, William. And look, for anyone on the call or anyone watching this after, please connect with William. We talk about what we can do to help make schools more equitable, inclusive spaces. William actually already does some of that and offers some courses and offers help and offers a range of resources to help teachers and schools and parents to influence that. So thank you for all the work you do, William. It's been great to hear your voice today. And I think that aspect of literacy is so important because I think I think a lot of people feel powerless, what can we do? How do we act? What do I say, when something happens? So I think the more we can talk about it and educate, we move forward to create those safe spaces. So thank you for that. Now, obviously, Beck, I'd love to hear from you as well. And I'm really appreciative of the work that you do. And I'm excited that these types of agencies are coming up whereby, you've created an organization that's focused on creating, more gender equitable spaces, looking through the gender lens, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it's good for business. It drives business performance. It actually helps the bottom line of a business, or in some instances, a school, to be more gender equitable. And so I'm really interested to hear from you. You've mentioned previously that, you think we need to have a top-down and bottom-up approach, that it's not, we can't just have one or the other, it has to be both. And that we need, part of that, and Sonia, you kind of spoke to this as well. So I think in a way, Beck, the work that you do kind of ties a few of the other people together unintentionally to drive kind of legislative reform, and that kind of hints at what you were talking about as well, Tanya. So talk about, if you like, the work that you do and BBCO do in terms of going into workplaces and schools to make them more gender equitable.
There we go. Thanks, Mark. I will cut straight to the chase because obviously, we all have a lot to say and a lot of very interesting expertise on this conversation. So it's been a great learning for me. The work that Brides and Bennett do is to actually create an assessment of where there is a gender opportunity. So we complement the DEI and the HR space, and we see ourselves working with people who are already evolved enough to understand that gender is a tool for great change. It's a great opportunity in which to, make sure that we are living in a more equitable society. And after dealing with business and corporate for so long and seeing how big the gap is and how long it's taking to change, it's an obvious thought, well, if we get to the kids, if we can start with educating the future generations, then maybe it's going to be easier when we're at the top. When we're talking to, the change that needs to happen that isn't happening. Now, ideally, we would work with the government and be able to do this en masse, but at the moment we're going in corporate by corporate, school by school, and creating an evaluation. It's everything from the way they communicate to the optics, to the culture, and then to in schools, the curriculum. And I have two daughters, my youngest pointed out that in the science lab, the anatomical drawings are all male default bodies. My year 11 daughter was commenting that yet again, the English texts are all about males. They're the central figures. If there's a female mentioned, she doesn't have a name. There's, the school hall is filled with the past principals. They're all males. It's these optics, this culture that sort of permeates through. And how can we change that? And after running an analysis and finding the opportunities for that change, it's really about bringing a toolkit in for the school, for the teachers, for the support staff, for the students to use. And it's easily fixed once you're in there and they're enlightened. I loved that fact about the 12 or 15 hours to change, if that's what it takes. And often that it is, long enough talking through this language and getting people to see there is a male and a female lens and everything in between, but those male and female anchor points of behaviour. And you know, our work, we're so thrilled when our work is done, when a client has said, okay, yeah, we were seen as heavily masculine, and they've closed that gap. It's not that they've become highly feminized, but they've found that gender neutral space where there's inclusivity for everybody, and that includes all kinds of diversity. So as I said, if we could get to the government and we could create this systemic change, which is the top down, we think change could happen very rapidly. But, you know, currently it's one at a time. And I'm hoping that this kind of brains trust will be able to help create change a lot faster. And because I know you're going to need to wrap up now, Mark. I'd love to, anyone who would like to contact us, love to be in touch. Thank you.
Yeah, I would encourage everyone to get in touch and follow Beck. I think it's really important, and I love the fact that you're doing it, Beck. Thank you so much, because, you know, I've been advocating in this space for a little while, and, you know, when I talk to many agencies who shall remain nameless, they pretty much give me a no, our focus is on the workplace. We're sticking to our lane response. We acknowledge that work needs to be done in schools, but we're focusing on the workplace. And I've done, you know, I've had more than 20 years in the corporate space myself, and I've just been baffled that the rules that we have in schools would be considered not only unethical, but illegal in the workplace. And I know that Madison's dropped off the call, but we wouldn't tell a woman in the workplace that she couldn't wear shorts or pants. We wouldn't tell a man in the workplace that he couldn't have long hair and tie it back to look professional. And yet we think that it's acceptable in school. So I'm really glad that, you know, you're being bold and brave and taking on the schools, Beck, because I think not only is it the right thing to do, but it's ultimately going to help our kids. You know, my kids are 5 and 8, and I suppose, like any parent, we want to create a world that's better than the world that we grew up in, you know, and I think all of us on the call today, if we're actively doing something about it, then maybe we'll nudge it forward. So I really appreciate the comments and the chat participation. I appreciate everyone's time and expertise. Big shout out to the people who have given their name and thoughts as speakers. Thank you so much. There will be a part 3 coming. There'll be an email coming out. I'd appreciate you to connect with each other. And as I mentioned, I am on a bit of a mission to try and you know, tackle and make some change. So if you want to jump on, then just reach out, and hopefully there's strength in numbers. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.